Special thanks to Bespoke Post for sponsoring this video. At the beginning of December 2021, I set out on a mission to review all of the live-action Spider-Man feature films in detail. I kicked things off with Tobey's trilogy, and then earlier this month I explored the often criticized but seldom appreciated Andrew Garfield films. Both of these experiences were wonderful as they offered me the chances to revisit memories from my early adult life in the case of Andrew Garfield and my childhood in the case of Tobey Maguire. However, today we are exploring something fundamentally different on so many levels, and I think far more challenging from a reviewer's perspective, and that is Tom Holland's contribution to the live-action Spider-Man mythos. These are not films I grew up with, and as such I predict won't be able to depend on the same nostalgic strings that the Tobey films did, or perhaps the same coming-of-age reactions that Garfield's offered me. Those two franchises I saw during formative parts of my life, and Tom Holland is the first Spider-Man actor cast that's actually younger than me, and no, I'm not salty about that, you are. Furthermore, these are films that take a fundamentally and enormously different creative approach to both depicting the character physically and narratively. Unlike the previous films, which were in and of themselves contained within their own respective movie universes, with Spider-Man as their main character, in 3 of the 6 films Spider-Man appears in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, he is not the main character. Not even close. How will this impact my analysis? Only time will tell, but these have been the films that I've been most excited to explore and revisit. So let's dive right into my review of every Tom Holland MCU appearance as he dons the mask as the definitive Spider-Man for a brand new generation of fans.
Underoos!
Hey, ho, let's go! Hey, ho, let's go! Hey, ho, let's go!
I have no idea how to write this review. These aren't words I would normally utter to myself, let alone write on a script and voice over my microphone to thousands of people, but it's true. The prior films felt much more self-contained by their very nature, and as such could be judged on the merits of each film, with perhaps minor references to the first film in the respective sequels. You see, the MCU Spider-Man requires those that have watched them to have seen specific parts of other Marvel films in order to get the full and complete experience. This is partially what makes the MCU so darn fun and immersive, but as a reviewer, it makes conveying my emotions concerning specific narrative decisions much more dependent on study and, well, having seen all the films that built up to that point that happened to span across 20 plus films. Peter Parker isn't introduced in his own film in the MCU, but instead he's introduced in Captain America Civil War, which into and of itself is a Captain America film. The third Captain America film, which deals largely with a moral dilemma between the likes of Captain America and Iron Man respectively, and Iron Man, oh geez, okay, I forgot to talk about Iron Man. The entire character of Peter Parker in this series is intrinsically tied on some fundamental level for the majority of these films to this specific character, who, by the way, plays a leading role in 5 MCU films if we are excluding any film he takes part in with Spider-Man. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is here, in order to fully appreciate and come to grips with the character of Spider-Man as he exists in the MCU, to be certain I understood what they were going for in these films, I needed to see every other film in the MCU. And well, I did that. Over the last decade, I've watched every film, and over the last year, I've watched all of them twice. And in addition to that, for the purposes of this video, I went ahead and watched all of the MCU Spider-Man flicks 3 times each, with his appearances in Civil War, Infinity War, and Endgame countless more times. So in essence, I am all Spider-Man'd out. So without further ado or preamble, let's start from the very beginning. Iron Man, okay, just kidding. We're starting with the beginning of Phase 3 in the MCU with Captain America Civil War. This is our introduction to Tom Holland's Spider-Man, and to tell you the truth, back in 2016, just 2 years after Andrew Garfield's Amazing Spider-Man 2, the sentiment growing in support leading up to this unveiling was that of, well, I don't want to say indifference. People were very much excited to see him involved in the MCU, but there was certainly a feeling that we had already seen the Spider-Man origin so many times, and we've gotten so many different Spider-Men so close together that it seemed like there was too short of a span of time between Garfield and Tom to really justify another reboot of the character. And I was one of those people, cautiously excited to see one of my favorite characters among the ranks of Marvel's dynasty built over the last decade. But I gotta say, Disney and Marvel, they really knew what they were doing with this character from the very beginning.
Do I need to do that? I know we're on different teams. I just don't want to be disrespectful to you.
You could surrender.
Everyone seems to have a different opinion on which actor is their favorite playing the wall crawler, but regardless of what you think, I don't believe there's any denying the unique set of skills and attributes Tom brings to the table for this specific role. In an interview with David Elson, the main stuntman behind Andrew Garfield's and Tom Holland's Spider-Man, he went into detail and opened up about what his experiences were like working on both incarnations of the character, citing the Mark Webb Garfield films as much more grounded, with a much more serious take on the character with a specific focus on appearing more spider-like in its movements. Whereas on John Watts' set, there was a clear and obvious leaning into the more humorous and human aspects of the character, with his more awkward mannerisms highlighted to draw attention to the boy beneath the mask rather than the alter ego that is Spider-Man, blending the two of them together to create something that I think makes for the most interesting approach to the character, at least from a directorial point of view. Furthermore, and perhaps most interestingly, at numerous points in this interview, David Elson refers to Tom as the real-life Spider-Man, showing his admiration for him not just as an actor, but as a performer and stuntman in his own right.
What's it like working with him? He seems like Spider-Man, for lack of a better way of putting it. He seems like Peter Parker in real life.
He is, and so much of that is to Tom's credit. Like, Tom is an amazing human being. He's one of my favorite people, one of my favorite actors that I've ever worked with. He's just such a nice guy. He's insanely talented. So like we also had like 3 months of prep, I think, on that show, and he would come in and train with us. And he's so damn talented. Like, we'd put him in the wires and he'd be epic in the wires. Him and I would like play add-on, or not even add-on. We would stick it. We'd play stick it. So like I would do a flip, and if I stuck it without moving, then he'd have to stick it before he could move on to the next level. And just like we kept doing that, and man, he was just sitting there right with me.
Wow.
Just keeping up. I mean, he's so talented, and he comes from a dancing background. He's an insanely talented dancer, and just he is Spider-Man. Like what you said is absolutely what it is. He is Spider-Man. Just the way he is just phenomenal, like abilities and just everything. He is Spider-Man.
And keeping all of that in mind, when I took the time to really sit down and admire his performance as both Peter Parker and Spider-Man in Captain America: Civil War, I really appreciated the quiet sincerity and clumsiness he brought to the role of Peter Parker as he struggles to confide in Tony Stark, whose dynamic with Peter, by the way, would be enough to easily carry a scene on its own, but there's so much more to it. There's a childlike optimism with this version of the character from the outset, which immediately caught my attention after coming from Tobey and Andrew's films, which concerned themselves largely with a tragic origin story from the outset to define the character. And that's what makes this Peter different from any other that we've seen. For this appearance, and indeed these early films, he's not necessarily defined by tragedy, but instead by his admiration for his idols. And this is where a prior understanding of these films comes in handy and serves to enhance the experience. Upon first meeting Peter Parker, Tony hasn't traveled to Queens to outright recruit him right away. Instead, this is more akin to an interview than an offer in many respects, with him testing Peter's wit, his honesty, and most importantly, his motivations, where his actions come from. And in perhaps the best moment of this scene, we get this look from Tony once Peter answers that very question. In this moment, he not only understands Peter, but realizes that this kid is in many respects on a similar journey to him. Peter's remark concerning him feeling responsible for bad things happening if he can stop them wholly and totally rings true to Tony's arc as a character, not only during this film, but within his entire run in the MCU from the beginning. It's the cornerstone of his character, and in establishing that commonality and bond between these two characters, the more screen time they share, the more we believe in their relationship and indeed Peter as a worthy Spider-Man. This film was very much trial by fire for the young character, allowing him to bounce off the likes of Tony Stark, Steve Rogers, and many others, introducing him to this franchise with a bang without detracting from the overall story of this film that centers around Cap and Iron Man specifically. From the little of him that I did see in this film, with him being a dumpster diver, unassuming, nerdy, interested in trying to do the right thing, all the while being starstruck by Tony, it served up a performance that convinced me upon first watching this back in 2016 that Tom Holland really and truly does make for a terrific Spider-Man and indeed a compelling Peter Parker.
Feel like I could be doing more. You know, just curious when the next real mission is gonna be.
2017 Spider-Man Homecoming. There's something I need to confess before I dive into my review of this film, and that's that in 2017, I wasn't a big fan of John Watts as a director. He had directed movies in the past like Cop Car, which is a good crime drama, and 2014's Clown, which is a not-so-good horror film. That is to say, neither convinced me that he had what it took in his wheelhouse to create not just a convincing coming-of-age superhero film, but a great Spider-Man movie. That was until the press junket promoting Spider-Man Homecoming, where he was interviewed and asked about the film on a technical level. And I adored it.
At the beginning of the movie, Peter loves being Spider-Man, but he doesn't love being Peter Parker. You know, Peter Parker sort of represents everything that he was, which to him is just a weird, outsidery, science-y nerd. And now he has this whole new future life ahead of him, being a superhero and having met Tony Stark and, you know, thinking that he beat up Captain America and all that. You know, that's all, he's already moved on. But what he hasn't done is sort of come to terms with who Peter Parker is and everything that sort of happened to him in the past. I think that's going to be the journey, is him realizing that you can't move ahead to be Spider-Man until you've really figured out who you are as Peter Parker.
There were obvious decisions made during the production of this film to help it stand out and feel distinct from the other Spider-Man feature films of the past. There's no traditional origin story in this film. Iron Man plays a pivotal role, and there's absolutely zero web swinging in New York City. However, what this film does have is a tremendous amount of heart and dedication to telling an honest and uplifting coming-of-age tale, the likes of which, to this day, still has elements that bring a tear to my eye every single time I watch it. And that's how I know I'm dealing with not just a tremendous actor that understands and cares for the character of Spider-Man, but a dedicated director with a compelling vision for what he wants to try and capture. Right off the bat, according to Tom Holland himself, director John Watts, before he even gave Tom the script for this film, assigned him a list of John Hughes movies to watch in order to get his mind straight for what he wanted to attempt with Homecoming and indeed this trilogy of films. And when I consider his approach through this lens, I can really see what they were going for. A young but eager protagonist yearning to prove himself, having to contend with questions of identity and maturity, all the while being faced with obstacles of troubling circumstances both from the past and present that in the end help to form the basis of who he is and ultimately who he will become. Dealing not with straightforward and unrealistic tales of black and white, but instead ugly shades of grey. And so, while this film does bask in the gift that is childhood and adolescence, it absolutely makes a point of contending with the nuances and troubles that come with that transition to adulthood. Michael Keaton's depiction of the Vulture, Adrian Toomes, has been widely touted and praised for his spectacular performance, and I am 100% in that camp too. And similar to other films featuring the wall crawler over the years, Peter's conflict in this film has an interesting relationship with his main antagonist. Like many wonderful villains across pop culture, Toomes, or the Vulture as he's often referred to, is a sympathetic antagonist to Peter's protagonist. Octavius, Norman, Marco, Dr. Connors, and Dylan are all to varying degrees sympathetic villains, with misfortune being a contributing factor to their respective rises as villains. However, I think of all of these individuals, the most human and understandable individual explored in this rogues gallery of villains is through Toomes in Spider-Man Homecoming. Initially hired to clear up the debris following the attack of New York in the Avengers film, after spending his life savings to facilitate this possibly lucrative endeavor, he's undercut by Stark Industries' middle management, leading him to a life of crime, stealing this tech initially in order to provide for his family. However, once he gets a taste of what's inside this metaphorical cookie jar, he sees it as a means of creating wealth for himself, to hit back at those that have treated him so harshly.
Business is good.
Spider-Man, or should I say Peter Parker on the other hand, isn't living so positively. This film starts his journey from the perfect place, reliving his proudest moments from Civil War in a brilliantly modern but character-rich sort of way. We get voiceover, talking heads, and the look on his face once Tony says that he can keep the suit says it all. He feels like this makes him an official hero now. It's a wonderful performance from Tom Holland, who, throughout this opening sequence, brings with him a childlike enthusiasm and innocent determination, running in direct contrast to Toomes' jaded and proud mentality, helping old ladies, stopping bike thieves, and other such minor incidents. After all we've seen him do in Civil War alongside Iron Man, this places us in the same mindset as Peter in this film. desperate to see him do more. But this movie, unlike the Andrew Garfield and certainly the Tobey Maguire films, isn't hell-bent on stripping this kid of his innocence with reckless abandon. Instead, the entire point of this film is to explore his more innocent and younger years. And it's in exploring that aspect of childhood that I think this film series does better than the Andrew Garfield films did in that respect. It creates a community. While not as explicitly camp and melodramatic as the Raimi trilogy, it does go to great effort to elevate the supporting cast through the likes of Aunt May, MJ, Ned, and a variety of other kids in his school that paint this world with a touch more color than it otherwise would have had without. And it's in these more lighthearted and fun high school moments we can feel the inspirations of The Breakfast Club and Ferris Bueller's Day Off reinforce this coming-of-age atmosphere. But, most importantly,
Sorry, Peter. I guess we're still losers.
Peter Parker feels like a loser. When we first discovered this young teen in Captain America Civil War, Tony sort of plucks him out of his regular life without giving us as an audience a chance to really see who he was or what his social standings were. But in this film, we can see plain as day why Peter holds those 15 minutes of fame when he rubs shoulders with the world's greatest heroes so near and dear to him. Because they were the single best moments of his life. Moments where he didn't feel like a loser, where he didn't feel like people were laughing at him, moments where he didn't feel like Peter Parker, but instead a superhero. And it's in pursuit of both Tony and Happy's attention and approval that he consistently runs into trouble with Toomes, who, once again, although indirectly, is put through some grief courtesy of Tony Stark and his new spider suit. Which brings me to the action. There are a large number of action scenes in this film, however my favorite is this. God, I love this movie for including scenes like this one. In previous films with Tobey and Andrew honing their powers, we caught glimpses and snapshots of them becoming the prolific web-slingers they eventually became, hurling themselves thousands of feet into the air with the greatest of ease. We never really got to see that awkward middle phase in any meaningful capacity outside of a scene or two. But right here, it's the star of the show and it serves the scene and film spectacularly, showing how brave Peter can be by blindly running to his friend's rescue no matter how dangerous it is, but also, in addition to that, it reinforces how limited his experiences have been and how far he still has to go until he's fully ready to take on the big bad world. I also love the choreography in this section where he flips and glides over the helicopter, smashes through the ballistic glass, saves everyone and shares what is perhaps an awkward but funny moment with Liz, courtesy of his in-suit AI, Karen. However, no matter what, when he's trying to be what he thinks Tony is looking for, he ends up falling further and further away from that end goal.
So, you got detention.
But this heroic image or bravado he seeks to demonstrate are exactly the opposite of what Tony saw in him day one in that very first scene they shared in Queens. He saw that Tony was impressed by his YouTube videos and that he said that he was in dire need of a major upgrade top to bottom. However, we know as an audience from looking at that scene that the moment he decided to recruit Peter wasn't because of all of those extraneous feats or powers, but rather his answer to that one question he asked him. What's his motivation? And in that moment of honesty, Peter Parker, not Spider-Man, Peter Parker, earned Tony Stark's respect and attention. In this film, Peter's pursuit of this image he's trying to uphold leads him to hack his suit, put all of his friends in danger, and puts his own life at risk on a number of occasions, resulting in him getting more in the way than helping the situation, until it reaches a boiling point where all his lies and pretense catches up with him, and he's confronted by the person he was looking to regain the attention of, Tony. There's a brilliant quote in this scene. In fact, there's a couple, one of which I'm pretty sure many of you will remember. If you're nothing without this suit, then you shouldn't have it. It's a brilliant line that speaks to the philosophical battle taking place in Peter's head, but the quote I love the most, and I think the quote that transcends this film and speaks to the entire trilogy, is this one shortly before that.
I just wanted to be like you. And I wanted you to be better.
There are turning points like this in pretty much every Western film, and most definitely coming-of-age stories where they're confronted by their flaws and have to make a choice. In this instance, Peter feels as though the choice has been taken away from him. Tony has taken his suit, and in Peter's own words,
I think this is all I have. I'm nothing without this suit.
and so due to his own mental block, right now he feels as though Tony has made his decision for him, resulting in a return to the status quo for the young teen. He goes back to hanging out with friends, participating in classes, and, well, really doing what he should have been doing before, focusing on his future and helping people when and where he can, which leads him right to where he wants to be, in a position where he can ask Liz to the homecoming dance, and surprisingly to Peter, she says yes. Suddenly, things are starting to look up. He feels a tremendous amount of responsibility lifted from his shoulders. His life seems to be going in a positive direction, and now he's going to pick up the girl of his dreams for homecoming.
You must be Peter.
When I first saw this in theaters, I was genuinely shocked. This might be up there with some of the better MCU surprises too. Not just for its clear shock value, but also for what it offers the story. The scene where Toomes drives his daughter and Peter to the homecoming dance, all the while we watch on as he creeps closer and closer to figuring out who Peter Parker really is shot perfectly and incredibly tense. There's not much in the way of commentary that I can point out that others already haven't pointed out, but what I do want to point out concerning this scene happens on a narrative level. Once discovered and confronted by Toomes, Peter is presented with a dilemma. Inside is everything he, as Peter Parker, has wanted. Friends, a relationship, some fun for a change, validation that he isn't a loser, a chance to experience things like a regular teen should. But Peter Parker, because of who he is, was only ever going to make one decision.
Look, when you can do the things that I can, but you don't, and then the bad things happen, they happen because of you.
This has always been who Peter Parker really is. It's precisely who Tony Stark saw that day, and it's the person who Peter's been unwilling to accept throughout this story. But he's always been there, amidst all of the naive decisions Peter makes during this film that lands both he and others into trouble. Littered across those are moments where the real Peter shines through, where he does the right thing irrespective of the consequences.
The other night you told that dude, if you're gonna shoot somebody, shoot me. It's pretty ballsy.
Following this, he confronts Toomes once again, thinking that he will be enough. However, he still hasn't accepted who he truly is. He's consistently tried to pretend to be something he's not throughout this movie, and right here, as he's being crushed beneath tremendously heavy debris, he crumbles, crying, screaming for help. This is a state and level of vulnerability we've never seen Peter Parker endure before. However, it's through this trial by fire that he looks down to the mask resting beneath him in a puddle. The words of Mr. Stark echoing in his ear, suddenly he knows that he has it within him. Whether he has gadgets or not, whether he has the support of anyone or not, on his own, he is enough. He is a hero. Only in accepting this is Peter able to find the courage he needs to defeat Toomes. The battle takes Peter to heights he's never seen before, forces him into circumstances he's never dreamt of, but he finds his way, never compromising who he was in the process, culminating in a moment at the end of the film where he stands in direct contrast to where he was at the start, with Peter Parker having started to come to grips with what it takes to be a hero, denying Tony Stark's offer to join the Avengers in their compound. Overall, I love this film, but as I pointed out in the beginning of this review, this is but a stepping stone on the long and arduous journey Tom's Peter Parker takes across the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Next up, Infinity War and Endgame.
Yeah, but first a quick word from our sponsor.
Subscription boxes are all the rage these days, and it's hard to find ones that are truly worth it. Ones that go beyond gimmicks and actually provide you with useful products that you will really use. Thankfully, Bespoke Post is one such service that delivers great stuff and at a fantastic price point. For me, their awesome cooking boxes are where they really shine. The Over Easy box, for example, comes with a high quality cast iron pan, which is already a steal, and yet there's also a heat resistant pot holder, pancake mix, maple syrup, and a Bloody Mary mix. They often talk about how every box has around $70 worth of stuff in it, but only costs $45, and that certainly rings true to my experience. The Feast box has a high quality carving knife, which is crazy when you think about how valuable good knives really are. Likewise, the Smoke box is insane value if you're looking to up your flavor intensity in the kitchen. This bad boy comes with a full smoking kit and wood chips, all for just $45. It's such a versatile service, and it's all picked for you based on your own own preferences when you sign up. So if cooking's not your thing, maybe you'll love their outdoorsy stuff or fantastic knives. You get to choose ahead of time so you can swap if need be, or even skip a month for no charge if nothing tickles your fancy. You only pay for what you want. If this all sounds great to you, then click the link in the description or go to bespokepost.com/notmark20 and use coupon code NOTMARK20 for 20% off your first box. It's difficult to know where to begin or even stop with my analysis of Spider-Man in this finale to the Infinity Saga. Combined all together, these are the two films that make up my favorite part of the MCU by virtue of how they solve so many narrative obstacles and delivered upon so many plot threads in what I consider to be an immensely satisfying fashion. However, for the purposes of this review, I can't afford to get too carried away with Iron Man's involvement, as I have two other films with which I want to talk about his impact on this character and the MCU at large. And so, just because this will be the last time we'll see Iron Man in this video, it certainly won't be the last time his impact or presence will be felt or referenced. Not by a long shot. So if there's something you feel like is important to the Spider-Man character in these films that I don't touch on, understand that odds are I will address them in the Far From Home section right after this.
Hey, man.
I think more than anything else, what Spider-Man and indeed Peter Parker adds to this film is a grounded sense of naive but determined altruism. A desire to help in whatever way he can and to show he's willing to stand up for something that he knows is greater than he could possibly imagine. Which is a really long-winded way of saying he's a nice and brave boy. The various action scenes early on come equipped with a quippy and well-choreographed nature to them, very reminiscent of Civil War, with Spidey going back and forth with Iron Man to achieve a desired outcome. However, unlike Civil War, we are now dealing with a more mature and fully realized version of Spider-Man. The kid that was once easily benched in Civil War following the airport battle now has a clear enough sense of self to follow what he believes to be is the right thing to do when his mentor tells him no. Even if that means chasing after his robotic sensei, and in doing so puts the fear of God into him. To what extent should Spider-Man be an extension of Iron Man at this point in his tenure? I ask this question because, at this point in time, following Endgame, after having been introduced through Iron Man to the MCU and having leaned heavily on Iron Man in his opening feature film, despite this being a truly breathtaking and emotionally rich performance from Tom Holland, as he gets snapped away and returns in time to aid in the final battle against Thanos before his mentor passes on, it's very much the case that in this film, Spider-Man is less of a main character servicing himself, but more so a key supporting character to aid Tony in reaching his endpoint in this Endgame. This fact, coupled with his prior dependence on the character in addition to his new Iron Spider look, gave fuel to a growing sentiment online. Is this Spider-Man or is this Iron Man Jr.? And in many ways, I can understand that point of view. However, there is something I would like to say in response to that, not necessarily from a narrative point of view right away, I'll address that later on in this video, but more so, for now, a financial and business sense. No matter how we may feel as a collective fandom surrounding these films, this franchise, or this character, Spider-Man as he currently stands in 2022 as of making this video, is not a Marvel Studios property but instead owned by Sony. This has been the case since before the Tobey films were even conceived of in 1999. And due to this fact, despite Spider-Man being a massively important character to Marvel even today, even as far back as Infinity War and Endgame, I could not see a world where Marvel, with all the success that they are seeing with their new characters, would thrust all of the weight and circumstance surrounding their biggest hitter, Tony Stark, to a property they ultimately have no control over. Doing so would simply ruin whatever leverage they would have during negotiation processes. With that said, when all the dust had settled following the events of Endgame, having traveled to space, fought against the most imposing force we've collectively ever seen in these films, and after becoming an official Avenger, with all the trauma that comes with that responsibility, Peter Parker emerges out the other end alive. But at what cost?
We won. Mr. Stark.
Spider-Man: Far From Home. I'm not exactly sure if this is a popular or unpopular opinion, but either way, I'm thrilled I finally have a chance to speak openly and freely about this film because, upon first watching this movie, I didn't like it all that much. However, upon my second and third viewings, it managed to become one of my favorite Marvel movies. And I'd go as far as to say that I think this is, in every sense of the word, not only a brilliant Marvel film, but a terrific Spider-Man story. However, if there's one thing that watching reviews of this film across both YouTube and Rotten Tomatoes has shown me, it's that what one person might define as distinctly Spider-Man, another might not recognize as such. Spider-Man and the coming-of-age journey he represents in pop culture is a broad one, a very broad one. And I think that's for the best. If Spider-Man could be narrowly defined, then by definition, that very audience that loves him too would represent only a narrow cross-section of the population. But instead, almost everyone loves or can at least on some level connect to the messages of this character. And that's one of the reasons why I love him and this film, because despite there being a multitude of forces at play here, some that drive the plot in a massive way, not limited to the now late Tony Stark, this film still manages to cover what I believe to be one of the most cathartic and powerful Spider-Man lessons I've enjoyed in a long time, both in a fictional narrative sense and in a very real, somewhat meta sense also. I've reserved a lot of time in this review where possible to discuss Tom Holland as an actor, and this is because I honestly find him fascinating as a Spider-Man actor.
No, of course I'm not a male escort.
Well, then you're Spider-Man.
And this is because I honestly find him fascinating as a Spider-Man. Whether or not you're in the camp of Toby, Andrew, or Tom as your favorite, something is very unique concerning Tom's circumstances in this role. And I noticed this a few years ago while Tom and director John Watts sat down for an interview promoting Spider-Man Homecoming. In it, it was brought to Tom's attention just how close his experiences with the role also mirrored the life of the character he was portraying, which upon hearing made me recall when longtime Spider-Man stuntman David Elson referred to Tom time and again as the real-life Spider-Man. Unlike Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield, who were both in their late 20s when assuming their respective roles as the Wall Crawler, Tom Holland was a largely unknown teenage kid. He had made a splash in musicals like Billy Elliot and some minor TV stuff, but outside of that, no one really knew who he was. I remember opening my PC back in 2015 and seeing this kid's face as one of the people rumored to pick up the mantle in the MCU as Spider-Man, and it was only when I looked into him and what he had to offer that I took notice. In addition to his dancing and rudimentary gymnastics background, he was much younger than any other Spider-Man that came before him. And as the years trickled on by and I eventually stumbled across that interview for Homecoming, I realized that Tom Holland, the actor's journey, mirrors Peter Parker's in many respects. Think about it. A relatively unknown kid gets scouted by the biggest name in town. He gets taken under the wing of their main guy and wants to do everything he can to not let him down by doing the best job he can. Eventually, he might feel as though the mantle is being passed down to him, and now for the first time, this young man needs to figure out how to man this ship all by himself without the help of his mentor's guiding influence. All the while, his large shadow looms overhead as the reminder of what he has to live up to. And this is all to say that Tom has, as of writing this video, been in 6 mainline MCU blockbusters and had his own trilogy of films by the age of 25. Still, by the way, younger than Toby and Andrew both were when they first put on the suit. Just something I thought was interesting to keep in mind. But for now, onto the review of Far From Home.
Does anyone have any neighborhood questions?
What is it like to take over from Tony Stark? Those are some big shoes to fill.
This scene right here summarizes the conflict in this film in a nutshell. If Homecoming was all about Peter exploring and accepting the strengths he has as Peter Parker, in other words, trying to eliminate any illusion he might have about himself, then Far From Home is a story detailing how Peter has to learn to see his mentor for who he truly was. Not as a deity without fault, but as a gifted man that struggled and failed just as much or more than any other person in Peter's life. In other words, he must learn to not hold himself to some impossibly high standard, and to stop doubting himself when he inevitably fails in living up to that impossibly high standard. To stop looking at Tony through rose-tinted glasses, but to, quite literally, look through the eyes of the man Tony believes he could be. That's what Far From Home is ultimately about at the end of the day. And once again, how Disney and Marvel have elected to leverage Tony for the purposes of this film is sensational and a perfect epilogue to the Infinity Saga, which concludes in this film. In terms of pacing, this is up there with the absolute best. The selling point of this movie is Spider-Man in Europe, and boy does it deliver on that front. In keeping with the MCU's dedication to help this Spider-Man feel distinct from the older incarnations, they are keeping him as far away as possible from the skyscrapers of New York City and instead have him occupying hostels in Venice, navigating festivals in Prague, and drone striking on alpine motorways. And that's just the first third of the film. I think my favorite part of this movie, at least in the first half before the story finally shows its hand, is how much John Hughes' influence can be felt. Within John Hughes' films, there's always a concerted effort to bring to light the individual humanity in as many characters as possible, whether they be high school kids or a middle-aged businessman from Chicago trying to get home in time for the holidays. And in Far From Home, you can really feel that driving the dialogue and indeed the narrative in some places. Ned and Betty's relationship is hilarious and cute, Brad's motivation to stop Peter from connecting with MJ on this trip is filled with hijinks, and Mysterio's ultimate motivation, once it's revealed, is understandable. It's not right, but we can empathize with the position he was put in by Tony Stark, which further speaks to his flaws as a human being that Peter needs to learn to accept. Quentin Beck is, in this film, a villain specifically because of Tony. He's proof that Tony isn't perfect. And speaking of Mysterio, can we just take a second to appreciate how brilliant Jake, I had to Google the spelling of his name, Gyllenhaal, was in this film. There's a bit of a mystery surrounding Mysterio. You don't say! Towards the beginning of this film. However, due to my being a fan of the old Spider-Man games and 90s cartoon, I knew full well who Mysterio was, which did take the fun out of what ultimately was a great reveal in the bar with Mysterio to get Peter's Edith glasses from him. However, I did get to experience the genuine surprise on my wife's face when I showed her that scene, so there's that. Prior to the reveal, Quentin Beck or Mysterio played on Peter's biggest insecurity, his belief that he can't live up to Tony's legacy, and in playing up to that, he becomes exactly what Peter thinks he needs, a mentor figure to hand over all of this responsibility to. And not for no reason, but because for the first time since becoming a superhero, he's happy to just be Peter Parker. He has other priorities.
You look really pretty.
Therefore, I have value?
No. No, that's not
I'm
what-
messing with you. You look pretty too.
Nowadays, there seems to be a ton of love out there for Zendaya as an actor, and in light of this, I find myself in the position to say, I too love Zendaya. Now, brave as a statement that is, I do have an explanation for my take. And furthermore, I wasn't always in favor of her version of MJ in this series. For the longest time, I was lukewarm on it, and this change of mind came about courtesy of a specific creator here on YouTube that I highly encourage anyone who's interested in learning more about Spider-Man to check out, and his name is Implicitly Pretentious. In one of his many videos deconstructing the topic, he drew specific attention to something I found deeply interesting and eye-opening. Whenever I watch a film or write a review, I'm always looking for another way to examine something that might offer with it a renewed perspective or a deeper understanding of the approach a filmmaker might take when making a movie. And in one of his videos, he discusses the broad topic of comic-to-film adaptation, with focus on the character Mary Jane Watson specifically through a modern lens. In my review for Mark Webb's The Amazing Spider-Man, I drew specific attention to Webb's incarnation or approach to adapting the character of Peter Parker for a modern era. As mentioned in that video, Tobey more closely resembles what Peter Parker would wear aesthetically in the 60s, but the attitude and getup Andrew carried through his performance ran closer to authentic for what Peter Parker might be if he was written for the year 2012. This is in effect why I love Zendaya's performance as Michelle Jones or MJ. You might have noticed that in my review for Sam Raimi's trilogy, I praised Kirsten Dunst's performance and her dynamic with Tobey. However, I did not praise it for its comic accuracy like I did Garfield's performance. In the comics, Mary Jane is quite progressive for the 1960s when she was introduced to the world, and while everything from the hair to the clothes Kirsten wore in the Raimi films felt true to the character in a classical sense, it failed to capture the spirit of the character, which was her progressive and exciting spirit. In fact, that incarnation of the character felt sort of, I don't know, conventional or sort of safe when I frame it that way. And so, enter MJ from the MCU. Understanding what I do now concerning Mary Jane from the original comics, MJ in the MCU is exactly what I would envision a modern take, channeling the spirit of that character might sound and act like. This is all to say, I love her performance in this, and while I don't feel as connected or invested in her relationship with Peter as I did with Gwen Stacy and Emma Stone, I can absolutely respect what she brings to this variation of the character, and I'm majorly impressed.
Wake up!
Quentin Beck, or Mysterio, is not only a visually exciting choice to attack Peter Parker within this film with, but is also, I think by design, a brilliant metaphor to represent the issues Peter Parker has to overcome in this story. I mentioned at the beginning of this section that Homecoming was the story of Peter coming to terms with his strength and worth as an individual Peter Parker. Independent of all the bells and whistles Tony's mentorship afforded him, that he has value, that he is a hero. In that same breath, Far From Home explores the natural continuation or evolution on that idea in Peter now having found a new lease on life as a civilian who wants to try and embrace and enjoy a normal life for a change. He's confronted time and again with either massive depictions of Iron Man at school or in the real world, and when he dons the mask as Spider-Man, people clamor to ask him if he's the next in line to lead the Avengers. And to him, he thinks this is ridiculous. He doesn't believe he can, because to him, he cannot possibly live up to what Iron Man represented to him. And so in this film, he struggles to overcome that image or illusion of Tony Stark in his mind in order to see the reality of the situation. And who better to face Peter Parker and his grappling with reality than the master of illusions, Mysterio. And the visuals surrounding these illusions are utterly spectacular with a capital S. Watching these illusion sequences in the theater left my jaw firmly planted on the floor, particularly when Iron Man came crawling out of the ground as a zombie, as an illusion literally haunting Peter. Eventually, and thankfully, this leads to a beautiful coming together with Happy, where he confesses to Peter that Tony, like Peter, always second-guessed himself, that the suave and calm front was exactly that, a front. And upon receiving this news and getting a new lease on life, the look Happy gives to Peter as he's working away on the plan for the final battle warms my heart and brings a tear to my eye every single time. And speaking of that final battle and confrontation between Peter and Mysterio, it's still up there as one of my favorite Spider-Man moments out of all the films I've spoken about across all 3 videos I've made on Spider-Man. The choreography is incredible, the visuals are appropriately massive, and it has a swerve at the end I honestly didn't see coming but was totally perfect for someone like Beck to try and pull off. However, my favorite aspect of this big finish was the philosophy behind its design. This is a movie about seeing people for who they truly are, whether they be villains, allies, mentors, or indeed yourself. To not allow yourself to be consumed by those illusions. And so the dependence on Peter's spider sense during this film was incredibly refreshing and frankly inspired, with it at the beginning of the film acting up, according to Aunt May, representing his inability to see through the illusion of Tony Stark's shadow. In other words, the incorporation of the spider sense, I think, acts as a beautiful metaphor illustrating that in order to take control of this situation and to save the day, Peter can't rely on a catch net. Iron Man can't save him. Another hero isn't going to come out of the woodwork. He must be willing to look deep within himself to gain clarity, to trust his intuition, to trust his senses, to trust himself, and to accept that Tony chose him for a reason. It's brilliant, it's beautiful, it's poetic, it's so damn Spider-Man, and it's a perfect segue into Spider-Man No Way Home. Spider-Man No Way Home. Spider-Man No Way Home is special, and as you can see, for the purposes of this review, I've elected to change the format up a little bit for this section, and I highly encourage anyone who hasn't yet seen No Way Home for themselves in theaters to do so if they have the means, because I sincerely believe that this is the best live-action Spider-Man film made in over 15 years. And since Spider-Man 2 back in 2004, No Way Home is the first Spider flick I've seen in theaters more than once. In fact, I went to go see it 3 times. I would have gone a 4th time, but Ireland went a little crazy with COVID over December and, well, my ticket got refunded. This is all to say that I believe Spider-Man No Way Home is a terrific film that made me tear up, made me laugh, and kept me at the edge of my seat from start to finish. And contained within it are elements that make not just for a terrific film, but the perfect ending to this trilogy of videos I've written over the last month in celebration of the live-action Spider-Man I've grown up with. So, what are we waiting for? Let's dive right in as this film continues from the conclusion of Far From Home without missing a beat. You could put these 2 films back to back and they'd flow perfectly. Furthermore, the pacing in this film, while a little lopsided with the first half feeling distinctly slower than the second, I will say that the first half isn't slow by any conventional means either. The first 10 minutes deals with a great deal, including the fallout of Peter's identity being revealed, to Matt freaking Murdock's introduction to the MCU films, to Happy and May's relationship troubles, to what this film's main driving force will be: Peter's desire to help his friends better their circumstances at any cost. Unlike any of the other films in the MCU Home Trilogy, this film also feels distinct due to its lack of focus or involvement of Iron Man in any capacity. The first had him directly involved, the second it was indirectly, and now this, his presence can't be felt outside of some extraneous tech here and there, which further adds to this feeling of isolation and dwindling options for Peter to utilize in order to better his friends' chances when applying for college. And that's one thing this film does a great job with right off the bat. This concept may or may not have worked in the comics, however, when adapted correctly into the modern day, the court of public opinion, as Murdoch puts it, is in full effect. People swarm MJ and Peter initially. A woman shouts out that Peter hit her, and as they jump to safety, a man is seen leaping after them. To compound this, protests are held outside of Peter's school, bricks are thrown through his window, and literally everyone in his life starts to treat him either as a god or a murderous criminal. And this is the strongest aspect of the film's first half. It really made me feel for Peter and ultimately understand where his thought process was when he was reaching out to Stephen Strange. This is where the story really starts to take shape. And again, with a time check, we're only 20 minutes into the feature. I've seen a lot of critics claim that the pacing in this first half of the film is slow, but in reality, I think it's quite fast and satisfying. And my only explanation for people feeling differently is that they compare it to what comes in the second half, or their anticipation of what comes in the second half, should I say. And I think that's largely it, because, let's face it, it was the worst kept secret in Hollywood in late 2021. Once Strange's spell flops and accidentally releases a ton of villains from past Spider-Man stories, the fun really starts to ramp up with references and interesting interactions as the order of the day. Dr. Octopus versus Peter on the bridge was choreographed spectacularly well, with some really interesting ideas at play concerning his Iron Spider suit. Fittingly, the method Peter ends up using to overcome Octavius in this instance is a difference that he uniquely possesses when compared to any other Spider-Man. Also, with his suit moving to protect his chest, it additionally to looking awesome and being an interesting way to reveal Peter's identity to Otto, it also plays into the theme of Peter consistently shedding more and more of Tony's materials, working towards that independent outcome that the film concludes with. On the topic of villains, however, let's call a spade because not all villains are created equal in this flick. Flint Marko and Dr. Connors are both in this film acting as the Sandman and Lizard respectively, however their involvement, particularly the Lizards, is quite removed when we compare it to more involved characters like Electro or Dr. Octopus. And speaking of Electro, in this film I found him so much more entertaining than he was in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Now that's not to say that this version of him would have worked better for that movie. I honestly would have a difficult time trying to convince myself of that. However, his suave and much more witty persona is perfectly fitting for so many interactions we get to see in this feature, particularly in Happy's apartment where we get a chance to explore so many interactions we thought we'd never see. And on the point of villains, I have to say something outright and without an ounce of hyperbole. I'm not sure if anyone else out there will agree with me on this, but Willem Dafoe's performance of Green Goblin and Norman Osborn in No Way Home might be better than his performance in the first Spider-Man flick with Tobey. And let me be completely clear here, I loved both, but I thought he had so much more to work with in this film and was afforded the chance to go even further with his insanity too. Like that scene in the apartment where Peter's senses are triggered and he dukes it out with the Goblin. That scene is, oh, chef's kiss brilliant. I mean, when he punches him time and again and the Goblin just laughs in his face, man, that's a moment that still gives me chills, and not even to make mention of the ending or... Okay, whew, breath. Let's talk about what Norman offers this story, because this movie simply wouldn't land or work as well without him. Out of all the villains used in this film, none is more important or contributes more to Peter's journey than Norman. One of the best choices in this film comes by way of Peter's motivation to save all of these villains. It's such a perfectly character-driven choice that speaks to his Aunt May's philosophy, which comes to a screaming and haunting conclusion in this film's turning point, yielding the single most important quote to live by in Peter's life, that with great power must also come great responsibility. And this took me off guard both intellectually and emotionally. Going off of Peter's very first conversation with Tony in his bedroom back in Civil War, I always assumed in the 6 months leading up to that conversation, his Uncle Ben scenario had already yielded that outcome for him, as he loosely speaks of that same responsibility in that film to Tony. It's what convinces him to recruit the kid in the first place. But similar to the Garfield film, it never sat right with me that that quote wasn't there. But thankfully, now we can say that it is. And when that moment hit like the train that it was, it made me realize perhaps the most important aspect of this story. This isn't just the culmination of a trilogy of Spider-Man films, but the culmination of Peter Parker's origin in the MCU. With his final trial coming in the shape of villains from the past and present offering him a moral dilemma, one that he needs to answer with mercy. Which, after what Norman did to his Aunt May, seems like an almost impossibility. Which brings me to everyone's favorite part of this film, the bringing together of Tobey, Andrew, and Tom's respective Spider-Men to one location and to share a heart to heart. One of my biggest worries going into this film was over how they might mishandle or fail to deliver upon what was a fascinating angle to tackle the darkest moment in this young character's life. But this delivers in more ways than I could have hoped to describe. And to that point, this is one of the darkest Marvel movies point blank, dealing with themes of death, anger, revenge, responsibility, and isolation. With this scene where Toby and Andrew support Tom being perhaps the best scene in the film, and let me tell you, Andrew freaking Garfield almost steals the damn movie. Tom Holland and Willem Dafoe share what are perhaps career-defining performances. However, after seeing this film 3 times in theaters, one of the most standout aspects of the movie still remains Andrew's tortured portrayal of a defeated Peter Parker following the events of The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Struggling and desperately clawing to what semblance of hope he has left in him, trying to hold on to Gwen's wish for him, to never lose hope. He doesn't have a ton of lines in this film, but this spectacular actor maximizes his minutes in this movie, let me tell you. Leaving me, honestly, in a situation where I feel like begging Sony for The Amazing Spider-Man 3 to give this poor character some closure. And speaking of other Spider-Man, watching Toby bounce back and forth with Andrew was special, and to tell you the truth, made me feel like a teenager again. And similar to the villains, what this film does extremely well is allow time for these characters to hang out and just shoot the breeze. And to tell you the truth, I'm counting down the seconds to when this becomes available on Disney Plus or Blu-ray because I want to watch it again. Which brings me to the ending, and this was, and let me tell you, in all honesty, perhaps my favorite ending to any Spider-Man film ever. Now, that might be subject to change over the course of the next year as this film settles deep into my subconscious, but there's just so much to love about this part of the movie. Getting to see Toby suit up again, Andrew redeeming himself by saving MJ and Electro wishing Spider-Man was black. All really cool nods to the past and future of this franchise, but perhaps more than anything else, what I love about this section is the final battle between Goblin and Spider-Man. With subtle touches like Peter going for a punch and us as an audience really feeling that impact, telling us that not only is Peter serious in this instance, but unlike earlier in the film where these pulled punches made Goblin's face light up with laughter, now they make him laugh for a whole other reason. They're an indication that Goblin is getting to him and that Peter is playing right into his hands. But Toby stops him. The anger in Tom's face crumbles to sorrow. It's a brilliant scene that climaxes with Peter making the right decision in the end, saving Norman. Over the years, one of the main critiques of this Spider-Man that I've noticed has been his dependence on the abilities and accessories of other people, predominantly Iron Man. So much so that it's led to numerous people over the internet label Tom's portrayal as Iron Boy or some variation thereof. And while I understand that sentiment, I can't help but praise Marvel's dedication to this idea. It offered Tom a tremendous way into the MCU with one of the most popular characters, it offered him a unique trauma that he alone had to deal with, and perhaps my favorite aspect of his alignment with Iron Man is the visual progression he demonstrates throughout the films as he becomes less and less dependent on the Stark tech, until finally he reaches the natural endpoint for Spider-Man, a down-on-his-luck teen living in New York City alone, wearing a costume he made, living with all the decisions and mistakes he's made in solitude. It's a haunting but perfect way to end this trilogy. With a kid that was once desperate for recognition in Homecoming, after going through tremendous loss and growth, developed into the adult we see today, totally willing to forego any and all recognition, quite literally, for the sake and well-being of his family, his friends, and the world. And looking back through this trilogy and his involvement in the MCU, I can't say I would change anything. It truly was, in every sense of the word, a celebration and a love letter to the spectacular and the amazing Spider-Man. Growing up, Spider-Man helped me to become a better person, and the only way Peter Parker, Spider-Man, and indeed Marvel can consistently achieve that valuable effect it has on people is by allowing their characters to grow, change, and adapt to the social ecosystems of the era they find themselves in. And in that respect, I think Tom Holland's version of that character is as important, iconic, and as valuable to the mainstream idea of Spider-Man as Toby and Andrew's contributions. However, if Marvel and Disney maintain their trajectory with this character in Tom Holland Spider-Man, it is my belief that he will be someday the definitive Spider-Man, not just for the new generation, but perhaps the old one too. Furthermore, this won't be my last Spider-Man video I'll write. I had plans to review Into the Spider-Verse as part of this Spidey-cember, but I think I'm going to wait for its sequel to release so I can give my thoughts on both of them together. Because honestly, that first film on its own deserves to be part of a big video like these ones did. So if you want to see that video or more videos like this, be sure to like and subscribe. It doesn't cost you anything and it really makes my day. With that said, I hope you enjoyed this Spidey-cember and I thank you so much for watching.
And they say that